Hello and welcome to my mechanic breakdown and blueprint showcase for my gameplay demo of ShutterSpeed. Inside figure 1, you can see how I reworked the player controller to allow controller input. I needed to add a widget interaction component to the player's controller so that it can directly interact with a widget component even during the paused game state. Figure 2 breaks down how I was using the player controller to enable button presses on the controller to interact with the UI. The top chain allows the player to select items from the on-screen UI by pressing the A button on the controller. I added a check to ensure this only fires when the UI is on the player's screen. The bottom chain enables the player to move backwards through the menus with the B button instead of going back to the button on the UI. Figure 1. This is where I get the game instance and check if the player has save data. I need to call the game instance because it is where all of the values are stored for all of the blueprints that I created. I use the game instance as it is easily accessible in any blueprint and isn't regularly called or edited like the game mode is. Figure 2. This is where I download the save data into the current instance. It checks if there is any save data, and if there is, it sets the values of the game. If there isn't any save data, the blueprint generates a save information actor and adds some basic values which allow the other actors to reference them without causing any errors. This is the save function. It can be called from any actor in the scene and takes values stored from inside of the game instance and transfers them into the save data. This is a long list that goes through all the values that the save stores. This is all the information that the line trace tracks before being cast to check if it can freeze an object. This code makes sure that an object has been hit by the line trace, and checks to see if it has physics enabled. It then takes this value and inverts it. Upon completion, it plays the camera click sound to give the player instant feedback. In figure 1, there is some code that showcases the current teleport destination, and checks to see if it has been set. It then teleports the player to a scene marked as the teleport spot. It then resets the teleport destination to ensure the player can't keep teleporting back to the same spot, even when it is not on screen. I decided to handle it this way as it reduces the load on the device, as I don't have to check if the object is still on screen in something like event tick. Figure 2 showcases the game object that checks to see if the player is still looking at it. To do this, I created a function using code I found online and used it to flip a boolean. If it is true, the object casts to the player and sets the teleport destination to itself. I also added functionality to help players realize which was the active teleport spot by adding a camera that appears if it's the player's current teleport location. This is what I used to animate the exclamation point on top of the collectible. This is to help draw the player's attention, as it is one of the few things that is moving inside of the environment and guides them to where the item is. Movement is something that the human brain instinctively notices and focuses on, so it is a perfect tool that I can use to guide the player to this collectible. I also chose to use a variable for the height so I can change how much the exclamation point moves depending on where the collectible is in the scene. This ensures I don't need any duplicate blueprints, as I also included functionality that allows me to change the mesh in the editor as well. The moving platform follows the same concept as the collectible for its movement. However, I decided to use 3 separate values to allow the platform to be used as both a horizontal and vertical platform. I chose to use 3 separate floats rather than a vector 3, as I find it easier to understand when looking at the blueprint. However, using a vector 3 would be the more correct way of performing this action. I also implemented a delay between the platform returning to its start position and then moving. This gives the player a set window where the platform isn't moving to hop onto without worrying about it moving out of the way. To make this blueprint more expandable, I could use a float into the delay and then set it in the editor itself. I decided not to implement this function as it gives the player a constant time frame where the platform isn't moving across the entire game. One of the things I wanted to have inside of the game was a visual representation of how many keys the player has. Rather than doing this for UI, I decided to have them follow the player. This was inspired by games like Skylanders, where the key follows the player around until it is used up. It also has some built-in logic which allows me to scale it up due to there being 3 slots on the player that the key can snap to. The puzzle gate was one of the most complex blueprints that I created for this project. I used an enumerator to give me 3 different options that I could use to change the gate's model. I decided that this would be the most efficient way to change the gate, as it would allow me to use 3 gate variants everywhere, which I can then tie to how many keys the player needs to have to open it. Since the player can only hold 3 keys in the current implementation, it allowed me to draw instant connection between the fancy gate, which would require the player to have 3 keys to open it, and the other gates requiring 2 and 1 respectively. This reduces the reliance on things like UI or the in-game text boxes to tell the player what they need to do to open the gate. Although this connection is something I want to reinforce to the player, I made sure to allow the keys required to open the gate to be a changeable value inside of the editor just in case I wanted to change it. One of the bigger challenges was how I could get the gate to block a player that can double jump and wall climb. To do this, I disabled the player's ability to wall climb on the gate object and created a blocker actor that I could place around the gate to prevent the player from jumping around the object. To make this feature better, I want to find a way that allows the player to head in one direction through the collision but not through the other. This would allow me to prevent things like players climbing on the top of the blocker object. This is a small code snip that allows me to spawn an object once a puzzle is completed. Although I didn't get around to using this inside of the game, I wanted to use it for things like dropping down walkways for the player in later levels. I used similar functionality as the gate to allow me to quickly change through the models, and used the actor class reference to allow me to create any blueprint class upon the puzzle being completed. To ensure that all of my blueprints were easy to understand to any outside developer, I used variable categories and comment boxes to provide context to the different functions. An example of the variable categories is shown in Figure 1. By using the variable categories, you can instantly see what functions use the variables and gives added context without going in and checking variable descriptions. Comment boxes allow a developer to quickly locate the blueprint logic even when zoomed out, as I use the pop-up bubble option, which allows me to keep the comment box text visible at all times. Figure 2 is an example of what the comment boxes look like inside of my player character. This is a macro that I created to format the text for the level time screen on the main menu. This allows me to quickly format the times without adding bloat to the blueprint graphs. On the left is the first sketch I made for the first level. It started off with just the 4 core islands in place to get the overall level flow for me to refine. I then went in and added the correct distances between all of the islands to allow for the player to jump across in distance and scale. This was especially important for this level, as its whole purpose was to introduce the player to the jumping and general player movement. I drew inspiration from Super Mario World 1-1, which gradually introduces the player to the different mechanics without compromising the level progression. After getting the scale correct, I then drew in the planned route for the level, which I highlighted in a pink dashed line as seen in the right image. This allowed me to plan the different level theming assets and how I was going to use them to guide the player. One big thing that I found whilst testing this level was that the final island was initially very intimidating, and by letting players see it straight away, as it took away from the planned route due to it not being a straight line. To try and combat this, I came up with another island that I would use to block the final island. This would act as a non-playable space and block the line of sight between the first island and the last. After getting the flow finished, I added outlines where I wanted the level theming and mechanics to be implemented, which allowed me to give the level sketch more detail and reinforce the path I wanted to guide the player along. Although this is the first level, I still wanted to reward the player for their exploring the space, which resulted in the addition of 2 islands for collectibles to be located on. This allowed me to build on one of my core goals for the project, whilst not changing the overall level flow. This is a screen capture of what the level looked like inside of Unreal Engine just after the grey boxing phase. This is actually the second version of level 1, as I went back after level 2's grey box to use the new workflow I had developed. For the grey box, I was trying to use foliage and fences to guide the player around the level without making it feel extremely closed in. In this shot, you can clearly see how the level progresses upwards as the player nears the level completion. I did this as an implicit guide to the player on the correct path that they should take. This is how level 1 looked at the end of development. Though I had a limited number of assets, I tried to use scale and rotation to provide some variety in the scene. From the grey box to this version, player guides in the form of signposts and guiding paths have been added as well. The paths allow me to add some more implicit route guides to the player whilst not breaking the immersion of the level. The signs are located around key mechanic introductions and allow me to coach brand new players without breaking the theming of the level. I also added a quick Unreal landscape and some animated water below the islands to reinforce that falling into the water would be a bad thing. These are my key level goals for each of the levels that I created. Level 1 was made to introduce the player to the basic platforming mechanic. Things like walking, jumping, sprinting, wall jumping, teleport to destinations, camera swapping were all mechanics I wanted to introduce inside of this level. I also added a rough setting outline to help me in my level design process. The goal was to have a rural location set in the British hillside, with 2 elevation changes and 2 distinct island plateaus. Level 2 was made to introduce the player to the core puzzles of the game. Originally, I wanted to introduce freezing objects in place, opening gate puzzles, and object spawning puzzles in this level. Level 2 went through considerable reworks during the sketch process, as I felt it originally was disjointed and looked like it would be annoying for the player to navigate due to the small islands and jumps that the player would need to make between them. To try and correct this whilst providing a variety of new level mechanics for the player to experience, I decided to add a moving platform. This was intended to be a slowly moving platform and introduce the player to moving jumps whilst keeping easy level navigation in mind. You can also see that I chose to move the key from around where the gate is to its own set of islands, on the left. I did this to reinforce the adventure element of the game. I also felt like having the key so close to the gate removed some of the learning process that the player needed, as it could have just been one of the things they picked up on their way to the gate in the first place. This is how level 2 looked, with only the island tops boxed out and the core mechanics placed inside of the level. For this design I tried to use height again to guide the player, but also needed to adapt how I was implementing the gates to stop the player simply jumping around and climbing up the island. One of the sort of things I tried to add inside of this level was a guide under the water to tell the player where the falling platforms were going to be coming from. This was a small addition but provides some player guidance and prevents the platform from falling onto the player unexpectedly. This is how level 2 looked at the end of development. For this level I tried to utilise more NPC text prompts to present the idea of talking to people for guidance during the level. I also added the same guiding paths and signs to help tell the player what was needed from them at any moment. I wanted to keep the same setting for the introductory levels to give the player a clear distinction between tutorials and fully developed levels. This allowed me to separate these levels from the more themed ideas for levels I had planned. For example, I wanted World 1 to be inspired by the UK, but due to the fact I couldn't find any assets for a UK city in the art style I wanted to, I decided to pivot towards a farmland concept that I have used for the 2 levels. To create my UI elements, I used a main blueprint that stored 3 separate canvas panels that had the content for each menu screen on them. I made sure to make a good use of naming schemes during this process, as it was important to know which button did certain actions due to me using a custom button rather than adding text onto an existing button. Although the menus are rather simplistic in construction, it was my first time using aspects like vertical boxes inside a UI element. Since these were necessary for me to enable controller input, it provided a unique challenge, as I couldn't just place the button where I wanted it to be on the screen. This is a snip of the code I run as the main menu is created. This uses a custom event to check how many stars the player has earned in the level and sets the textures based on the result. Although this method isn't perfectly optimized, it reduces the bloat inside of the core blueprint, and by using descriptive names for the inputs, you can easily tell what the function needs to work. This is what the different elements went into my custom button. By creating a custom button, I allowed myself to add core functionality such as changeable text to all of my UI screens quickly without going in and adding a text box to each individual button. It also meant that I could create a hovering animation that would work for all of the buttons. This is important as on controller it would be hard to tell what item you currently have selected in the UI. If at any point I wanted to change the design of my buttons, I could easily go into this blueprint and change them all at once, or even add more core functionality. Due to this being a custom button, I had to create some event dispatches to use inside of the main UI system. This allowed me to create some basic outlines for what each action should be doing before going into the specifics of what the button needed to be doing within the main UI system. The custom level select button follows a similar process to the custom button I created. However, since this was going to showcase a lot more data from the save, I made sure to give an easy way to change the textures from the main UI blueprint rather than inside the code for the button itself. The option screen was a challenge to set up, as it required me to learn about volume mixing inside of Unreal. To achieve this end result, I had to create a sound class that were then used in the blueprint to adjust the volume. This allows me to change multiple sounds at the same time as the game is running, rather than the volume of a single effect inside of the editor. This blueprint also gives the player an indicator to what slider they are on, and changes again if they have it selected. This allows the player to easily navigate the screen. The pause screen uses logic from the main menu but pauses the game, which was needed due to the timer that the levels have. It also uses background blur to provide a break between the gameplay and menus. Although the game is relatively small and loads quickly on my device, I decided to implement a basic loading screen that keeps the player informed on what is currently going on. This widget is called before I load any level and should prevent any confusion during the loading process. Player onboarding is an important part of gameplay, as without it, a player will struggle to understand what they need to do to progress. It also allows me to provide a base layer of understanding which ensures that all players will know certain aspects. A good example of this is someone new to platforming games might not draw the connection between pressing the A button on the controller and jumping. By teaching the player this, I can ensure that all players know how to jump through the rest of the project. Sometimes systems are more complex, meaning that even experienced players will struggle to understand them at first. By providing some contextual information, I can break down the complex systems to a player in an easy to understand way. Although the levels aren't in their final form, I wanted to provide some guides in a way that doesn't break immersion of the level. By using pictures and a recognizable button prompts, I'm able to communicate what the player needs to do for that part of the level. These implementations are quick guides that would get swapped out before the project releases, but allows me to communicate where I want them to be shown to the player, and also a rough guide as to what they should have on them. For this project, I tackled combining PC input with controller input. To implement this properly, I made use of Unreal Engine's input mapping system, which allowed me to go in and add the buttons to each event, which provided an easy way to update any mappings that would need changing in the future. For controller input, I found a useful graphic from Andrew.Senko, which covers all the buttons on an Xbox controller and how easy they are to access for the player. This gave me a solid base to create mappings from, as I tied the key mechanics to Tier 1 buttons. By doing this, I was able to get good feedback from playtesters early on, meaning I had a solid base to build on. I created the tracks inside of a browser extension called Beatbox. This allowed me to take notes from instruments and create a tune out of them. On the right there is a graph of one of the tracks I made, and on the left is the same track but inside of Beatbox's editor. As I wanted to keep a more retro arcade style for the music, I created 2 to 3 different sections for each instrument and made them alternate over time. To use my audio inside of Unreal, I needed to set up an audio master component which allows me to add the smaller sound classes to it. Hello, my name is Reese. I'm going to take you through my gameplay demo of ShutterSpeed. In the background is some developer gameplay of the demo. When setting out on this project, I decided to focus on creating the most engaging gameplay that I could. To achieve this, I tried to combine key level design principles with mechanics. I also wanted to focus on one of my weaknesses as a game designer, player onboarding. To achieve this, I wanted to create a level that introduced the player to the key mechanics of the game in a calm way. As I started my planning for this project, I decided that I wanted this game to combine adventure with speedrunning. This allows all sorts of players to enjoy the experience but adds a competitive element which quantifies how skilled a player is. To achieve these goals, I made sure to clearly plan my development using Trello. I also created a work plan inside of Excel which planned out what I was going to be doing each week. I set 3 key milestones where I could conduct playtesting to ensure the project was heading in the right direction. For my 3 milestones, I set the following goals. Milestone 1. Level 1 greyboxed, player teleport implemented, object freeze implemented, puzzle gate implemented, player movement setup, as well as the core UI elements. Milestone 2. Create a level timer and implement saving into the game. I also wanted to have level 2 and 3 greyboxed. Milestone 3. Player onboarding experience implemented, NPC interaction, and an art pass on all of the levels. I also made sure to plan in some stretch goals, like a 4th level, full NPC dialogue implemented, which would allow the player to walk up to an NPC and they would give the player some information. This would be a more detailed system, whereas in Milestone 3 it would come through the form of text boxes placed in the world. Over the course of Milestone 1, production went extremely well, with the player teleport and freeze functions being implemented over the course of week 1. These weren't the final implementations of the mechanics, but provided the feel and function that was necessary to progress onto greyboxing the next week. I also had the base UI implemented for keyboard and mouse, which were done slightly ahead of schedule. However, I did make the decision to cut the reverse area time function as it felt out of place and would take up too much project time trying to code and implement it. Milestone 2 ended up progressing mostly on schedule thanks to optimizations in my workflow. A good example of this is my method for greyboxing the levels. I would sketch them out roughly on paper, then refine them adding the planned path and key locations such as pickup spots. For level 1, I had to go into Maya and create each island individually. This was time consuming and also didn't end up with results that looked particularly good. For level 2, I brought the image into Unreal and placed it onto a plane. Then, using Unreal's modelling toolkit, I would go around and trace the outline for each individual island. After creating the models from the sketch, I give them some small theming, usually giving them a slight gradient down to the floor so they weren't floating. Although this method allowed me to skip making the models inside of a modeling software, such as Maya, it did come with a few drawbacks. The islands used a complex collision which restricted how I could use them. They didn't have a custom UV map, meaning the textures were limited to a base colour to ensure they didn't end up looking weird. And sometimes they didn't scale nicely due to the more organic shapes that I was using for them. During this milestone, I found a big problem with some of my previously done work. The menu system that I created did not work at all with controller input. Although I am only packaging the project for a PC, one of my main goals was to have the game fully playable with a controller. This meant going back and redesigning the entire UI. I shifted to using custom buttons, which I learned how to make using a wide range of YouTube tutorials and experimenting with different blueprint solutions. Tutorials from Brian Laley, as well as Unreal forum posts, got me through some of the process, but still required lots of small adaptations to work in the correct way. This requirement to redo the entire UI system took considerable time away from my initial goals and caused me to instantly cut off all of my stretch goals, as there was no way I could reasonably achieve them. Luckily, I used this time to add some more features to the UI, such as a working volume slider that updates the audio in real time. I also implemented the blueprint base for the rating system that I planned on adding during Milestone 3. Although this setback was rather frustrating at the time, I was able to learn how to use custom buttons and produce a working UI that I have an in-depth knowledge of how it works. At the same time, I was having issues with the asset packs that I decided to use for the project. One of the asset packs that I was using had 100+ versions of each asset, which was causing instability and the file size for the game to increase massively. Although the work I lost due to system crashes was relatively low, thanks to me keeping backups and saving regularly, this problem took me far longer than it should have to diagnose and solve. Another issue with the asset pack was how they export the assets. The scale and pivot for every model was different, meaning I had to go in and use blueprints to manually scale down and solve the pivot issues. As a result of these setbacks and the close proximity of Milestones 2 and 3, I had to cut some of the Milestone 2 content. This was done by cutting level 3. Since this would be the most complex level, which I planned to take 35 hours, it allowed me to correct most of the setback and ensure that Milestone 3 was as complete as possible. Despite this, Milestone 3 was interrupted by lots of change in direction. I realised that this was the best time to start implementing some of the player onboarding assets, which required me to go into Maya and create and texture them. It was also at this point where I decided to go in and create some of the more specific models that I couldn't source from online, to give the levels that I did have some more theming and guiding elements. This wasn't something that I had originally planned to do, but since level 3 was cut, I decided to use some of the extra time to give the levels that I had already made some more theming and decoration. One of the biggest parts of this milestone was getting saving to work properly. As it is a quick platforming game, there wasn't a need for a save button to keep progress during the level. This allowed me to only store information on what the player had picked up and the player's best time for each level inside of the save function. Due to this being a completely new thing for me to try and implement, I relied on the Unreal documentation, which allowed me to get the save function complete. In regards to my initial goals, I think I've been able to produce 3 nicely refined mechanics in the teleport, freeze, and timer functions of the game. These 3 mechanics function well and have been optimized to be as consistent as possible, whilst also being easily changeable inside of the editor itself. I have also been able to produce a nice sample of level design work. I have utilized height change to guide the player instinctively, as well as providing guiding paths to aid the player with direction. The levels are nicely contained, but I would like to try and create a larger scale level in the future, to allow for more variations in directions for the player to go. Over the course of this project, I was able to achieve lots of progress and create a portfolio piece that I am proud of. Although it is missing some features, I feel like I was able to produce a fun demo that I plan on expanding in the future. I also learnt a lot about how inefficient some of my work processes were. Things like the UI needing to be redone should have been avoided through testing the UI with a controller earlier to ensure it works properly. This would have saved me lots of time and allowed me to produce most of the cut features instead. I have also learned that sticking with a poorly formatted asset pack only costs more time than it's worth over the course of the project. If I had spent more time earlier on in the project making sure all of the assets I had sourced were correctly formatted and fit for use, I would have saved myself considerable time and given myself the opportunity to expand the demo further. Other things that I have learned thanks to this project will allow me to save lots of time in future projects, such as learning how to create a working audio system and dynamically update its values. If I was to attempt this project again in the future, I would make a few changes to the way that I would approach the workload. I found that by scheduling 8-hour, 5-day working weeks, I was setting myself targets that I would never be able to reach. Although the original scope of the project was definitely doable in the 12-week period, the pressure and stress created by the workload caused me to make mistakes and go off plan too often. Adding on to that, I think rather than trying to schedule each week, I would be better off starting each week with a session where I break down what I hope to do each day. This would reduce the time I spend worried that I was overrunning on a task and give me a clearer plan of what I need to make. I also think learning how to do basic character animation would be a massive improvement. One of the main reasons I decided not to change the character model for this project was that the animation side of Unreal is extremely intimidating to me, and I didn't want to spend time trying to get the player character working properly, rather than create and refine mechanics which I'd already planned to do. Changing the player character was also something I hadn't planned to do for the project, but would allow me to create a more cohesive environment. The final thing that I would change is the variety of different aspects of design that I tried to tackle. Although gameplay is a massive category, I ended up making 3D models, creating entire systems that were only gameplay adjacent, and even spent some time creating audio. This was simply too much to try and achieve during this period, and was a major contributor as to why I wasn't able to produce all of the levels that I had planned to make. In closing, I feel like this project has produced some work that I am proud to have made, but has suffered from an overambitious plan and caused me to stretch myself too thin, which prevented me from achieving everything that I wanted to. Thank you for listening to my development breakdown of ShutterSpeed.